Good afternoon, and welcome to the continuation of our program, The Long Road to the Vote. My name is Helen Compton Harris, and it is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the WNDC Educational Foundation and the extraordinary group of partners that we are bringing to this program, that are bringing the program to us. I am the Director of Outreach and Development at Richard Wright Public Charter High School for Journalism and Media Arts here in Washington, D.C. We have recently concluded a wonderful oral history project with the Education Foundation here, where one of our students created a video that we will share to teach other high school students how to capture oral histories using the ubiquitous cell phones so that they can capture the voices of our history and of our community. Yesterday, we experienced the long road to the vote, marking the centennial of the 19th Amendment with a discussion with four historians, fabulous historians who trace the remarkable journey of women in the 19th and early 20th centuries and the emergence of Black women leaders. Indeed, one of the outcomes of this centennial overall has been the increasing recognition of Black women leaders and their roles in history. So often left out, and even with us, now we can begin 100 years of activism today, 1920 to 2020, is a quote from Crystal Eastman. She was a strategist, Vassar grad, who recognized that the 19th Amendment was wonderful, but it was only the beginning. Her work as a suffragist focused, however, primarily on economic freedom for women and reproductive rights. Sadly missing were the other words of social justice and racial equality that Black women who were in the suffrage movement brought to the forefront and have led the fight and won many battles, not just for Black women, but women overall. I have the distinct honor this afternoon of introducing Dr. Martha Jones, who has a remarkable career. And she remarked that the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment is a chance to recover less well-known histories of women and the vote. If we take away little else, the suffrage centennial can teach us how the Black women leaders of 2020, from Stacey Abrams, Ayanna Pressley, Michelle Obama, and Kamala Harris, have emerged out of centuries-long struggle for political power in movements led by Black women themselves. Today, we recognize a second, less remarked upon phenomena, the creation of organizations by these African American suffragists that contributed in substantial ways to the achievement of the political gains of the era. It is a remarkable story. However, one could not have anticipated that these organizations would continue to thrive throughout the next century and beyond, and would play the critical roles in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the push for widespread voting, the emergence of Black women leaders in the 21st century. Today, we will explore these organizations and how they evolved and honor their contributions over the last century, from before 1920 to 2020. Our first speaker, Dr. Martha Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is both legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is a remarkable prize-winning author. Her latest book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, is available in our Centennial Bookstore, along with other resources for educators. Professor Jones is a public historian, frequently writing for broader audiences at the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education and Time, and was most recently narrator for the PBS special, The Vote. It is a pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Martha Jones.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks to everyone for being here. I want to especially thank the WNDC for convening us. Thank you to President Pamela Johnson, who has really been tireless in organizing such an ambitious and important set of convenings that mark Women's Equality Day. It's an honor to be here with my colleague, Dr. Allison Parker. But I want to offer a special and really heartfelt appreciation to the leaders of the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs Incorporated. We all stand on the shoulders of these women leaders and the organizations, the more than a century of leadership that your organizations have offered to us. So I'm really honored to be here with you today. I want to start with a short discussion of myths. When it comes to the story of women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment in particular, I think two myths still predominate. And I take part of our work to be in the centennial year to be replacing some of those myths with some good history. Now, the first myth is that when the 19th Amendment became law, all American won the vote. We even sometimes hear that women were guaranteed the vote by the 19th Amendment. And the second myth is that, on the contrary, that no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept Black women from the polls. So in this anniversary year, it's time to replace, I think, those myths with some history. Voting rights in the United States have always been born out of struggle, and the battles waged 100 years ago for a constitutional right for the vote and against Jim Crow really echo in 2020 as American women work against voter suppression and full access to the polls in our own time. Now, 100 years ago, in August 2020, it was the U.S. Secretary of State who certified that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified by the required 36 states, Tennessee being the last state to ratify the amendment. But it took another week for the amendment to reach Washington, and I'll just remind us for a moment of the language. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What did this precisely mean for American women? Now, laws that reserved the ballot for men were in violation of the Constitution, and still, the 19th Amendment did not promise any women the vote. State laws, still kept women from the polls based upon age, citizenship, residency, mental competence. American women in 1920 who married non-U.S. citizens were denaturalized and no longer could vote. The women who showed up to register in the fall of 1920 confronted many sorts of hurdles, even if sex was not one of them. For our conversation, of course, today, we must highlight one additional barrier, and that was racism. Racism that persisted in keeping African American women from the polls even after a constitutional amendment. Now, it was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870 had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race, but by 1920, lawmakers in the American South had set in place a formidable set of hurdles that, while silent on their face about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black men. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women vote? Did they win the vote in 1920? Well, certainly not all women. African American women in too many states became merely equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirit of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. Registration numbers reflected the effects of discriminatory laws. In fall 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found that the books were closed. In Kent County, Delaware, for example, their numbers were unusually large, but officials refused Black women who failed to comply with the constitutional tests. These were tests that required new registrants to interpret complex provisions of the Constitution before their names would be added to the rolls. In Huntsville, Alabama, only a half dozen Black women were among the 1,400 who registered, and the explanation was clear. Officials applied practically the same rules of qualification to women as are applied to colored men. In Savannah, Georgia, officials imposed the letter of the law, concluding that many Negro women have registered here since the suffrage amendment became effective. But the election judges ruled that they were not entitled to vote because of a state law which required registration 6 months before the election, even as there was no 19th Amendment 6 months before the fall of 1920. This kind of ruling meant that no women in the state of Georgia could vote. Too little time had passed, but this was a reading of the law meant to expressly suppress Black women's votes. The first wave of Black women voters, of course, had been unleashed even before 1920 as individual states made women's suffrage the law in California in 1911, Illinois and Chicago in 1913, New York in 1917. Black women had already shown that they were prepared to register and vote, that they were experienced voters by 1920, and even more were able to join them that fall in the wake of the 19th Amendment. I'll offer just a couple of short examples. In St. Louis, Missouri, Fannie Williams was a teacher who turned organizer and set up headquarters at the city's Black YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, named for the 18th century enslaved poet. There, Black women ran a suffrage school and prepared for their chance to register, teaching one another how to pay poll taxes and pass literacy tests, even when administered by begrudging officials. They turned out, and papers reported that nearly every woman in the city registered that season, Black and white. Now, why register to vote? Well, in St. Louis, segregation is emerging as the order of the day, and the polls were critical. In 1916, a segregation ordinance had passed after voters had come to the polls. And what Black women knew was that that victory had been won in part because on election day, Black men had been intimidated. Many of them had even been arrested at the polls on false charges rather than have them cast their ballots. So here, Black women knew that there were extraordinary hurdles in front of them, but by the winter of 1920, they had really proven themselves. And the local Black newspaper, the St. Louis Argus, praised Black women suffragists in this headline: "Race women will soon become powerful political voters." And so when the 19th Amendment was adopted finally in the summer of 1920 in a city like St. Louis, Black women were ready for the challenges ahead. In Daytona, Florida, educator and National Association of Colored Women's Clubs leader Mary McLeod Bethune had traveled the state in 1919 and 1920 to encourage Black women to register, only to be confronted by a brutal opposition, a wave of violence that beset prospective Black voters throughout the state. That violence visited Mrs. Bethune very intimately. Her home, her industrial school for girls, for African-American girls in Daytona, on the eve of 1920's election day in November, was visited by the Ku Klux Klan, robed Klansmen riding horses, burning crosses, who came onto the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's school to intimidate her as a leader, but to intimidate her faculty and, of course, all of the Black women in Daytona. What we know is that on the next day, those Black women turned out. they relied upon the safety of numbers, and they took courage from leaders like Mrs. Bethune and from their own numbers. Now, what happens next in the life of Mrs. Bethune is storied, and I try and capture much of that in the new book I've just written called Vanguard. We know that she will go on to, in many ways, do an end run around the problem of disfranchisement in Florida. By 1922, it will be extraordinarily dangerous for Black voters, men and women in Florida, to head to the polls. Klan violence has really come to rule the scene for now. Mrs. Bethune will, in essence, do an end run around the obstacles, the local obstacles in Florida, come to Washington to establish now the National Council of Negro Women and to win the allyship, first of President Franklin Roosevelt, and she will assist President Roosevelt in establishing what became his Black cabinet. Why is this important for our story? Because Mrs. Bethune understands that political power comes in many forms, and disenfranchisement does not mean that Black women sit down or stay home when it comes to political power. Instead, they learn to work around the problem of the polls. What Mrs. Bethune knows is that a president like Franklin Roosevelt can put Black women in positions of power by appointment, wholly skipping over the problem of voter disenfranchisement, skipping over the problem of whites-only primaries that keep Black candidates off the ballot. Mrs. Bethune uses her relationship with Franklin Roosevelt to get herself and many dozens of Black women into key positions in those New Deal federal agencies that are intended to lift Americans, including Black Americans, out of the strife of the Depression. Mrs. Bethune is there to exercise an outsized leadership precisely because she understands how to work around the problem of disfranchisement for African American women. Now, Mrs. Bethune's story is fabled because she lives a long and remarkable life, and her vision will continue to grow, to expand over the course of her many decades of activism. By 1945, she is not only an important friend to Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, whose bust I think is lurking somewhere behind someone's Zoom image, but Mrs. Roosevelt is critical in assuring Black women a seat at the table in Washington, partnering with Mrs. Bethune. They are frequently photographed together intentionally with the belief that this image of a leading African American woman and a leading white American woman is one part of the struggle of defeating Jim Crow and getting Black women to the ballot. Mrs. Bethune will go on to be the sole Black woman delegate in 1945 to the San Francisco meeting that founds the United Nations. And there she will link arms with women across the globe, women of color across the globe, who see in the struggles of Black women in the US a mirror image of their own struggles against colonialism and sexism in places like Brazil, India, South Africa, and more. It is an extraordinary life of activism. But I want to end by just returning for a moment to 1920, because what we know is that Black women face a set of extraordinary challenges out of the disappointments and the limits of a 19th Amendment that by design, by intention, does nothing to interfere with, to override, or to set aside the Jim Crow laws that will keep so many Black women from the polls. This is the open secret of ratification of the 19th Amendment. And in 1920, Hallie Quinn Brown is the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Hallie Quinn Brown has cut her political teeth at Wilberforce University as an educator. She has been trained as an elocutionist at the Chautauqua Institution. And she had led the NACWC's suffrage department for many years in the years leading up to ratification of the 19th Amendment. But now she's president, and she faces the challenge of bringing her organization into a new phase of the struggle for women's votes after ratification of the 19th Amendment. And Brown writes to Alice Paul, who heads the National Women's Party and by 1921 is much credited with ratification of the 19th Amendment. And she's rather insistent with Alice Paul, who is planning a celebration, a pageant that will unveil a monument to Elizabeth Stanton, Susan Anthony, and Lucretia Mott in the U.S. Capitol. Hallie Quinn Brown is quite insistent that the women of the NACWC be present there. She says as much to Alice Paul, and indeed on the day of this pageant, the women of the NACWC are there. They pose in front of the monument. A banner is unfurled. This is a success for Hallie Quinn Brown. But on her larger objectives, she will be disappointed. Hallie Quinn Brown has really come to win Alice Paul's support for federal legislation that would now give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendment. Hallie Quinn Brown is looking for a federal law that will set aside, override, as I said, and get Black women to the polls like their white counterparts. And she calls on Alice Paul with a delegation from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, implores Paul to join with them and continue the fight for the full realization of women's votes. What we know is that by the end of that season, Alice Paul will convene the last of the meetings of the National Women's Party. That organization will fold. Alice Paul will go on to champion a new cause, the Equal Rights Amendment, but she will leave African American women to continue work in their own organizations, in alliance with African American men, in their sororities, in their clubs, in their teachers' associations, in civil rights organizations, and more. It is the start of a new movement for women's votes, one that, of course, takes us all the way along the arduous, dangerous, remarkable road to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I think I'll stop there and say thank you all very much. I very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for this inspiring talk. I learned a lot. If the audience has questions for Dr. Jones, please put them in chat so that the panelists can see them, and we will respond to them later in the program. Good afternoon. I'm Pat Worth, and I'm the Executive Director and the CEO of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that is building the sole national suffragist memorial in our country. It will recognize all of the millions of suffragists who were involved in the movement from even before Seneca Falls in 1848 through a little bit past 1920. Our organization is very honored to have partnered with the WNDC Educational Foundation, the National Women's History Museum, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and other remarkable partners in the DMV area and across the country on this centennial program, The Long Road to the Vote. I also had the privilege of serving on the advisory committee that selected the recipients of the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award, which we will award today. Significant research went into identifying possible candidates. The awardees were selected by a committee of scholars and leaders from partners. A number, I think we're taking a look at who the partners have been, will come up on the screen, but a number of those committee members are with us today. Shirley Moody Turner from the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University, Arthelda Bush Williams from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, Diana Bailey from the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, Justice Yule and Pamela Johnson, president of the WNDC Educational Fund, who did a Herculean effort in coordinating our efforts today. The committee identified organizations that met the following criteria. Number one, they were founded by suffragists prior to 1920. They have continued for at least 100 years to fight for civic values and voting rights that Mary Church Terrell espoused. And three, they have not received the full recognition that they deserve for their many contributions. The committee quickly agreed to name the award after Mary Church Terrell and sought and received the enthusiastic support of her family, which still lives in her final residence in Highland Beach, Maryland. We located an exquisite pin that was given to Mary Church Terrell by the NACW in 1904 for her leadership as its first president. A copy of the pin has been placed on the award certificates. The pin was in her possession when she died and was given by her family to the National African American History Museum. The committee identified 3 organizations to receive the award today. Remarkably, Mary Church Terrell, in her long and extraordinary productive life, played important roles in all 3 of the organizations that we honor today. And now, before we present the awards, we are privileged to hear from Dr. Allsion M. Parker, who is the author of the forthcoming biography of this giant of a woman, Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell. I understand that you can pre-order the book in this event's online bookstore, so you can take a look there. Dr. Parker is Chair and Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. She has long research and teaching interests in women's and gender history, African American history, and legal history. Most recently, she was an Andrew W. Mellon Advanced Fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. Dr. Parker is the editor of the Gender and Race in American History book series for the University of Rochester Press. As chair of the Delaware History Department, she is committed to helping to build a coalition of students, faculty, and staff promoting a wide-ranging anti-racism agenda. It is my distinct pleasure to present Dr. Parker.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pat, and thank you to Pamela Johnson and the WNDC Educational Foundation and all of the partners for inviting me to speak today. I'm thrilled to be able to take part in a celebration of the feminist and civil rights activist Mary Church Terrell, as well as of the organizations that have carried on her values, including longevity and persistence in the struggle for equality, women's education and educational leadership, and gender and racial justice, including women's voting rights advocacy. First, a general introduction for those who might not know much about Mary Church Terrell can also highlight the concept of a centennial of struggle. Mary, or Molly Church as she was called, was born into slavery in 1863 during the Civil War. Gaining her freedom at the end of the war, she grew up to become an activist who spent over 6 decades engaged in social justice work before she died in 1954 in her 91st year, the same year as Brown v. Board of Education. Let me take you through the decades of Terrell's activism. Her early 1890s voting rights activism and leadership in the Black Women's Club movement led to her 1896 election as the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, or NACW. She and Ida B. Wells Barnett were the only two Black women who were founders of the NAACP in 1909. And by the early decades of the 20th century, Terrell was a sought-after public lecturer, campaigning for federal anti-lynching laws, congressional enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and a constitutional amendment securing women's voting rights. She served as the only Black delegate to two major international women's conventions in Europe, including one at the end of World War I. And when the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, Terrell was thrilled to be appointed as a political organizer and speaker for the Republican Party, which at the time was the party of Lincoln and the party that most African Americans were still supporting. From the 1920s to the 1940s, she also worked for social justice within newer organizations, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, and the National Council for Negro Women. In the 1930s, Terrell joined Don't Shop Where You Can't Work boycotts and picketing campaigns and supported the Communist Party's efforts on behalf of the Scottsboro Nine. And after World War II, she helped desegregate the American Association of University Women and led a national campaign to pardon a Georgia sharecropper, Rosalie Ingram, who was sentenced to death for having tried to defend herself against an assault by a white man. Finally, Terrell also led a boycott of segregated restaurants and shops in the nation's capital and was a plaintiff in a lawsuit. The Supreme Court decided the case in 1953, the year before she passed away, deeming racial discrimination in DC restaurants and shops to be in violation of the district's long-ignored 1870s anti-discrimination laws. So I share this very long list with you to give you a sense of just a few of the activist things that Mary Church Terrell did. And partially it's to honor her, but it's also to honor and show how appropriate it is to give an award to these organizations that are focusing on longevity, persistence, and dedication to gender and racial equality, because that's what Mary Church Terrell's lifelong activism really embodies. The Mary Church Terrell Award cites on it one of the contributing factors is women's education and leadership as a key value. For her, having heard firsthand tales of the oppression of enslaved women from her maternal grandmother, who was prohibited from learning how to read and write, Molly Church vowed to achieve a higher education degree. Accepted into Oberlin College, the young feminist insisted on graduating with a Bachelor's of Arts degree, also called the classical four-year gentleman's course at Oberlin, rather than the traditional 2 years ladies course. She was often the only woman, not just the only Black woman, enrolled in fields of study considered exclusively for men. Her friends pointed out that Latin and Greek were difficult to learn and that it was unnecessary, if not positively unwomanly, for women to study, as she put it, an old dead language. Worst of all, she recalled, they claimed, it might ruin my chances of getting a husband since men were notoriously shy of women who knew too much. But enjoying her gift for languages, she refused to restrict her studies on the basis of sex, just as she resisted racist prescriptions throughout her life. She happily noted, lo and behold, it was discovered that women who have studied the higher mathematics, philosophy, and Greek make affectionate wives, fond and devoted mothers, and safe, sane, and conservative cooks. In fact, Molly Church did find a partner who valued her education, Robert H. Terrell, who headed the Latin department at DC's M Street segregated colored high school when she arrived to teach there. He was the first African American to receive an undergraduate degree with honors from Harvard University and a law degree from Howard University, and he supported women's equal education and voting rights. By virtue of having attended the predominantly white Oberlin College and having graduated from there, a young Molly Church had automatically received a membership invitation to the American Association of University Women, which in effect assumed she was white. And so she joined after she settled in Washington, D.C. But she let her membership lapse in the early 20th century because very few African American women were welcome. As more Black women began earning bachelor's degrees, the National Association of University Women kept most of them out by barring all graduates of Black colleges and universities. The National AUW was exclusive, and so it's that in that context that later she sues with a white friend of hers to try to get admission and desegregate the institution. So in response, in 1910, Terrell invited 12 Black women college graduates to gather at her home to found a national professional networking and advocacy association for all Black female college graduates called the College Alumni Club, which is now called the National Association of University Women. So clearly, Terrell aptly represents the value of improved access to higher education for African Americans, especially girls and women. The Mary Church Terrell Award also celebrates the value of work for gender and racial justice. Terrell was a lifelong advocate for equal voting rights. When speaking to white women suffragists, she tried to help them see their own racism. In particular, she implored them to understand women's voting rights from a broader, more inclusive perspective. She and other Black suffragists always linked women's voting rights, as Martha Jones was talking about, to improve civil rights for all Black Americans. Terrell pointed to lynchings, segregation, poll taxes, literacy tests, and the convict lease system that kept Black men disenfranchised, especially in the South, after the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. White suffragists, she urged, should join the fight with Black women and men against all these forms of disenfranchisement. Black suffragists like Mary Church Terrell also found militant and direct activism appealing. Terrell had long known of and admired the radical tactics of British suffragettes. For instance, she had recorded in her 1909 diary, "In the evening, I went to hear Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst, the militant suffragette, and enjoyed her address immensely." Not surprisingly, Terrell eagerly joined in one of the major national direct actions that took place in the United States, which was the 1913 National Votes for Women Parade in DC. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized the huge suffrage parade for the National American Woman Suffrage Association on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Unfortunately, Paul tried to insist that the parade be all white or be segregated. Many of us know the famous and true story of the anti-lynching activist and suffragist Ida B. Wells Barnett, who refused to march in a segregated delegation at the back of the parade and inserted herself into the Illinois delegation. What is less well known is that this is not the solitary act of one defiant Black woman. In fact, many dozens of Black women marched all throughout the parade. An editorial by W.B. Du Bois in the NAACP's The Crisis describes the politics surrounding their participation. The Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time settling the status of the Negro in the Washington parade. Finally, an order went out to segregate them, but telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. Black women organized, protested, and won the capitulation of the National Association. A Black Chicago paper, the Broad Axe, also captured the scene that day. The equal suffrage parade was viewed by many thousands from all parts of the US. No color line existed in any part of it. Afro-American women proudly marched right by the sides of their white sisters, it reported. Black women carried the state banners for New York and Michigan and were integrated in many sections of the parade by marching as artists, homemakers, teachers, nurses, doctors, writers, club women, musicians, and college students. Mary Church Terrell served as a mentor to Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority, whose members had organized and incorporated to take an active role in politics and reform movements. The students wanted to march together alongside the other contingents of college women, and Terrell negotiated with Alice Paul on their behalf. On the day of the march, Terrell explained, some of the white suffragists still objected to having the colored girls of Howard University march in the parade, but Inez Milholland insisted that they be given a place with the pupils of the other schools. In spite of what a Washington Post editorial said this month, the 25 Deltas marched alongside the other college delegations dressed in their caps and gowns, not at the back. And then Mary Beard, the feminist and US historian, invited Terrell and her fellow NACW club women to march with the New York City Women's Suffrage Party, which they did. Those who joined the state delegations were indeed at the back, but only because organizers had a carefully choreographed chart for the parade and had planned for all the states to assemble there. If we better understood that Black suffragists collectively fought for and won the right to participate throughout, we would have a different story to tell of Black women's pivotal role in the suffrage movement that I think is even richer than one that focuses on Ida B. Wells Barnett as the sole heroine of the story. As Dr. Jones mentioned, even after all women gained, or with these exceptions, gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, the gulf between white and Black suffragists did not diminish. And in fact, Alice Paul ignored Hallie Quinn Brown and Terrell's and other Black women's demands that the National Women's Party work to secure Black voting rights in the South. Paul initiated a new campaign for women's equality in 1921, but rejected a proposal by Mary Ovington, a white feminist and NAACP board member, to invite Mary Talbert, who was the incoming NACW president, to speak from the platform as the official representative. Instead, she allowed only token participation by Black women. Paul stubbornly insisted that the NACW was not a feminist organization, but rather only a racial group, and so banned it from formal participation in the National Women's Party. After much negotiation, a few Black women were allowed to speak as individuals at the 1921 National Women's Party Convention, including Mary Church Terrell. She described how she addressed the Resolutions Committee asking for a congressional investigation. I said, colored women need the ballot to protect themselves because their men cannot protect them. Since the 14th and 15th Amendments are null and void, colored women are lynched and are victims of Jim Crow laws and the convict lease system and other evils. Trying to make the interconnected issues of Black women's disenfranchisement and violence against them seem real to the disinterested and distant NWP members, Terrell described the terrifying gendered brutality experienced by African American women. She gave the specific example of the pregnant married woman, Mary Turner, who was lynched in Georgia in 1918 for protesting the lynching of her husband. She said, a colored woman, 2 months before she was to become a mother, had her baby torn from her body. What did she do? Coolly asked a white woman. Another said, she did something, of course. Terrell's heart sank upon hearing white feminists' cruel and insensitive comments about the brutal murder. She had wrongly hoped that her white female audience would empathize and find the incident as deeply disturbing as she did. But NWP's members' interest in protecting women's equality and their bodily integrity did not extend to those who were Black. when a sympathetic white ally then presented their minority resolution on the convention floor, the NWP members voted it down. Even so, during the same convention, Mary Church Terrell and her 23-year-old daughter, Phyllis, who had both picketed with the NWP, defiantly and proudly went to the Hotel Washington to get our Distinguished Service Medals for picketing the White House. We all carried banners and marched in. Our pins are in the shape of banners. Insisting upon African American women's full humanity and equality, Terrell's feminism and suffrage activism were based on her understanding that gender and race were inseparable, interconnected factors in Black women's lives and oppression. Throughout her life, Mary Church Terrell directly attacked the legal and social institutions that perpetuated racism in America. Identifying herself as a colored woman in a white world, Terrell saw Black women's status as unique. A white woman has only one handicap to overcome, that of sex. Colored men have only one, that of race. I have both, sex and race. I belong to the only group in the country which has two such huge obstacles to surmount. Denying an easy or universal sisterhood, Terrell insisted on calling attention to the difference that race made in Black women's lives. She bluntly told white women reformers, "I assure you that nowhere in the United States have my feelings been so lacerated, my spirit so crushed, my heart so wounded. Nowhere have I been so humiliated and handicapped on account of my sex as I have been on account of my race." White Americans' racism, Terrell charged, was a form of assault and battery committed on a human being's soul. Her speeches and articles consistently exposed the lawless violence of whites, as well as their brutal exploitation of Black women's labor and bodies. In a dominant culture that defined white women as the only victims of rape, Terrell condemned the mistreatment and sexual abuse of African American women at the hands of white men, especially those in vulnerable jobs such as domestic service. Insisting upon the full humanity and just treatment of African American girls and women, Terrell pointed out that those caught up in the criminal justice system had little ability to exercise their citizenship rights. In 1912, Terrell met with the governor of Virginia to defend the life of a poor African-American teenage girl sentenced to death in the electric chair for accidentally killing, in self-defense, her abusive white female employer. And she went to that meeting with other women from the NACW, including Hallie Quinn Brown. In fact, there were 3 of them. After the 1919 riots in DC as well, Terrell approached the public prosecutor to defend a Black teenage girl against the false charge of murder after her family's home had been invaded by gun-wielding whites. And in 1953, Terrell led delegations of women to meet with Georgia's governor to advocate for clemency for Rosalie Ingram. When the lives of poor African-American women were on the line, Terrell embraced alliances and coalitions which spanned the class spectrum and truly lived up to the values we are celebrating today of advocacy of gender and racial justice and equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. This was just simply wonderful, this talk about a truly great woman. I'm very pleased to say that our national memorial will have 3 statues in it, and one of them will be of Mary Church Terrell. So we really enjoyed this. If the audience has any questions for Dr. Parker, please put them in chat so that the panelists can see them, and they will be responded to later in the program. I think now we are going to turn to our presentations of the awards. And if that's correct, I'm looking to see the Delta Sigma Theta certificate to go up on the screen. Am I correct about this? Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Inc. was founded in January 1913 by undergraduates at Howard University, including suffragists Stella McCarthy Adams, Winona Cargill Alexander, and Bertha Pitts Campbell. Just 6 weeks later, in its first public act, a group of young women from the sorority marched together in the first National Suffragist March in Washington, D.C. Mary Church Terrell was an honorary member and a mentor to its members. From its early years, Delta Sigma Theta has remained committed to voter education and participation, civic engagement, the development of leadership, and the strengthening of communities. The sorority and its members combated voter suppression of Black men and women, worked with the Southern Black Freedom Movement to push for voting rights, fostered leaders. Its members have made important contributions to the endeavor for civil rights, including Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Dorothy Irene Height. Broke barriers in seeking and obtaining political office, including Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to Congress and the first African-American and woman to run as a major party candidate for president. Barbara Jordan, the first African-American woman from the South to serve in the House of Representatives, and Carol Moseley Braun, the first and only African-American woman elected to the Senate. Supported a wide range of programs addressing education, health, international development, and strengthening of the African-American family. Under the National Social Action Commission, encouraged member engagement with legislative issues which impact the African-American community and skill development, such as how to advocate effectively, understanding the role of congressional staffers and how to monitor and track legislation. Engage in ongoing voter registration and voter education programs, including programs that advocate for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the repeal of voter disenfranchisement laws, the full restoration of voting rights for individuals who have paid their debt to society, and the full implementation of the Help America Vote Act. It is a great personal honor for me to present the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award to the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The inscription reads, you can read along with me. For more than 100 years, your organization has fought for voting rights, organized for gender and racial equality, increased voter registration and turnout, promoted women's education and leadership, and worked to improve the quality of life in your community. The fortitude, leadership, and dedication to service of your organization exemplify and deserve this honor. It is with great pride that I have been asked to present this award to President Beverly Smith, who will accept the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award. I've had the privilege of working with her colleagues, two former Delta presidents, Dr. Paulette Walker and Dr. Thelma Daly. Mrs. Smith, please accept our congratulations on receiving this honor on behalf of the Deltas and its extraordinary century of contributions.
Thank you, Mrs. Worth. I truly appreciate it. I am so excited to receive an award named after our very own member, Mary Church Terrell. Her history, and Dr. Parker, you did an incredible job. I just sat here beaming with pride, even as I heard more about our member, Soror Terrell. She was outstanding. She truly was an initiator of our first public act, which was to be the only organization of African-American women, African-Americans, even though there were others there, to march as an organization in the suffragette parade. She was one who is important to us, really talks about our DNA, and I often talked about the DNA of Delta Sigma Theta in terms of who we are and what we've done. You also have mentioned before Mary McLeod Bethune, who is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta. We're very proud of that. Our DNA and our heritage talks about Dorothy Height. You've talked about Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, and others who are members. We continue today to make sure that we stay actively involved in the civil rights and social action movement. We've had 2 members who were cabinet members, one for Jimmy Carter, Patricia Roberts Harris, and Alexis Herman. Also Loretta Lynch, Attorney General, is a Delta. We've had 11 mayors. Keisha Lance Bottoms is often in the news today. The mayor of Atlanta for her fortitude and fight in terms of support. 3 African American women who were Surgeon Generals of the United States. All 3 were members of Delta Sigma Theta. The list goes on, but I'm just really pleased to say and honored that we can say that there are 12 postal stamps with members of Delta Sigma Theta who are honored and recognized. I wear this violet today, not only to represent Delta Sigma Theta, but I think it's not coincidence that the suffragist movement, the flower of that movement, was also the violet. And I wear that not only in honor of those that we recognize on this 19th Amendment, but also in honor of Delta Sigma Theta and in honor of our SOAR, Mary Church Terrell. I thank you all so much. This means more than you can know, to receive an award that recognizes the history of Delta Sigma Theta in social action and the history of our beginnings as we began walking in that suffragette march on that difficult day. But it has led to, unfortunately, it took till 1965 before the Voting Rights Act was enacted. And I hear you talk about the fact that some of those privileges in the 1920s were taken out because states were allowed to make a difference. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did the same thing with that Civil Rights Act in '65 and has taken some of those liberties away from that. But as women working together, and I emphasize women working together, we can and will continue to make a difference in this country. We will all take the lead of those that were honored and recognized, and that you mentioned over time, in making sure that the rights of women continue, and that we work to make sure that they are stronger in terms of what we do. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate this recognition in honor of the long road to the vote. I guess you could, in fact, call it that. But the committee, I thank you in terms of your support of our organization and in support of those things that we all hold dear. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Please accept our congratulations on this well-deserved honor for your extraordinary contributions over the century. I am Shirley Moody Turner. I am co-director with Gabrielle Foreman of Penn State's new Center for Black Digital Research. It is home to the Colored Conventions Project, the Black Women's Organizing Archive, and Douglas Day. We are especially proud to be launching the Black Women's Organizing Archive, which brings together the scattered archives of 19th and early 20th century Black women organizers and activists. We were honored to partner in some of that work on Anna Julie Cooper's archive with AKA members, SOAR's John C. Lancaster, Juanita Ferguson, and other representatives of the AKA sorority. So with that said, it is a distinct pleasure to be asked to present this award to Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated was founded on January 15th, 1908 on the campus of Howard University. It was the first Greek letter organization for African-American women and was founded by suffragists Nellie Mae Quander, Ethel Hedgeman Lyle, Lucy Diggs Slow, and Norma Elizabeth Boyd. For the past 112 years, Alpha Kappa AKA has actively taken part in civic engagement. In the 1930s, AKA sorority formed the Nonpartisan Council to Lobby for Civil Rights and the American Council on Human Rights in the 1940s. They too were on the front lines of women working for suffrage. They worked with the Southern Black Freedom Movement to push for voting rights and were an inaugural member of Operation Big Vote in the 1970s. They registered more than 350,000 new voters in the 1980s. They sought to increase African-American voter participation rates in the 2016 elections to mirror or exceed those of the 2008 and 2012 outcomes. they created a voter awareness program called Be the Voice to address education, registration, mobilization, and participation. AKA's International Connection Committee recently created AKA LEAD, which stands for Lead, Empower, Advocate, and Decide, to encourage and educate people to register for the 2020 presidential election and to help engage voters to make their voices heard, encourage online voter registration, and educate about mail-in voting. In all, AKA has fostered political and community leadership for more than a century, most recently evidenced by their mobilization in support of their member, Kamala Harris. It is with great pleasure that we present the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award. We thank you for your service to all mankind, especially regarding the work that AKA Sorority Incorporated has done to have a lasting impact on voting. It is my honor to present this award to the International First Vice President, Miss Danette Anthony Reed, who will accept the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award on behalf of AKA Incorporated.
The members of this prestigious organization, my sisters of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, good afternoon. I am humbled and honored to accept the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award on behalf of our International President and CEO, Dr. Glenda Glover, and the members of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. As an organization of more than 300,000 women, comprising more than 1,025 chapters around the world, and whose leadership spans from the classroom to the boardroom, we understand that voting is a serious matter. Alpha Kappa Alpha members are activists in their communities and on the national stage. We have a strong and vibrant network within our organization that will continue to mobilize and ensure the success of voting in this year's election for another 100 years to come. We have the power and the leverage to activate Black communities and beyond to ensure that every vote and all voices matter. Our members will always answer the clarion call to serve mankind for our election efforts. As Sisters of Alpha Kappa Alpha and Sorority Incorporated, it is our objective to promote human welfare through social reform, protect human lives, preserve human dignity to ensure we make a difference now and for the future. Your foundation is to be commended for the work being done to recognize the contribution of our organizations who have been involved in the voter movement for more than 100 years. I know our combined commitment to the vote will surpass all expectations for centuries to come. Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated is honored and humbled to receive this award. We remain committed to ensure every vote counts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Reed, for those beautiful words and for your acceptance. You have inspired us, your organization and your source inspire us to go on and look at the next century. Thank you very much. I'm Pamela Johnson. I'm the president of the WNDC Educational Foundation, and it's been my privilege to work with partners and colleagues and scholars to prepare this event. Our next award goes to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. In 1895, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin issued a call for a new unified national organization to bring a new era to the colored women of America. A year later, in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was formed to that end. The founders and some of the early members are a virtual who's who of Black suffragists: Ida B. Wells, Barnett, Harriet Tubman, Frances Harper, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Anna Julia Cooper, Fanny Barrier Williams, Mary Church Terrell was the first president. In the early years, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs supported anti-lynching legislation and fought Jim Crow segregation, poll taxes, and disenfranchisement of Black men. NACWC went on to establish a suffrage department. The superintendent, Sarah J.S. Garnett, was the founder of Equal Suffrage League of Brooklyn, New York. They supported the Voting Rights Act in 1965, held voting registration drives nationwide, and provided citizenship classes for women. They purchased and preserved Frederick Douglass's home until it was moved to the Park Service in 1962. The leaders have contributed to the establishment of other organizations for racial uplift, including the NAACP, the National Urban League, and the National Council of Negro Women. With a motto of lifting as we climb and a commitment to service, NACWC established multiple institutions and programs in communities nationwide: day nurseries, kindergartens, homes for orphan children, housing for college students, evening schools, industrial training centers, and homes for the ages. It is an honor to present the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, Incorporated, the first national organization of African American women in the United States. The inscription reads, "For more than 100 years, your organization has fought for voting rights, organized for gender and racial equality, increased voter registration and turnout, promoted women's education and leadership, and worked to improve the quality of life in your community. The fortitude, leadership, and dedication to service of your organization exemplify and deserve this honor. It is my privilege to present this award to Ms. Opal Bacon, the second Vice President of NACWC, who will accept it and provide some remarks."
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. President, Mrs. Andrea Brooks Smith, is not a Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award. Not only does it recognize the tireless and timeless work of this organization, it also honors the first president of our organization and her accomplishments. Because of Mary Church Terrell and the countless women with her, we have the ability to celebrate women's suffrage for the outstanding accomplishment it is. 124 years ago, our organization was created to better the lives of women and children everywhere, to ensure that justice was equally distributed to all. Due to the legacy of strength imparted to us by women like Mary Church Terrell, we are able to stand today, still advocating. Although it is heart-wrenching that similar battle is still being fought in 2020, we find it heartwarming knowing that we don't stand in this battle alone. We have sisters and advocates who fight with us. We offer our sincere gratitude to the Committee of Leaders and Scholars from the Partners for the Centennial Program, The Long Road to the Vote, for honoring us with this award. We ask that each of you make a conscious effort to make lifting as we climb your lifestyle and not just your motto. And she signs it, "Thank you, Andrea Brooks Smith, 30th President of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs." As you already know, NACWC Incorporated is the oldest Black women's organization. Since our insemination in 1896, the women of NACWC Incorporated have always advocated, fought, and strove for equal access to the ballot box. In the very beginning, many of the founders and members of NACWC Incorporated either formerly enslaved or one generation from slavery. These great women knew what it meant to be marginalized, degraded, discounted. Our founders, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Harriet Tubman, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and countless others in our organization paved the way for the concept of universal suffrage. These women understood that in the order for Black women to take their rightful place in society, they must not, could not be under the rule of systems established by men, whether it was at home, work, school, or politics. Today, much like the great women we founded this organization, the women of NACWC are dedicated to expanding access to the ballot boxes. We're working to pass the H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020, and much more. The members of our young adult department and our youth department are being trained to fulfill leadership roles within our organization, as well as in the workforce, educational fields, and politics. During the age of COVID-19, our individual clubs and chapters have been on the ground in our various locations, registering people to vote and hosting virtual forums and workshops. We've been teaching people how to fill out and return mail-in ballots. We invite each of you who are interested in either joining our organization or to collaborate with us on some of our various projects to send us an email, and you can do this on our website, nacwc.com. Universal suffrage was our goal in 1896. It remains our goal today and tomorrow. And this will be our goal until each person who is granted the right of citizenship in this country has equal and just access to the ballot box. I leave you with this statement from our first national president, Mary Church Terrell, which is often quoted by our current president, Andrea Brooks Smith. And so, lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling, striving, and hoping that the buds and blossoms ere long, with courage born of success achieved in the past, with a keen sense of the responsibility which we shall continue to assume, we look forward to a future large with promise and hope, seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs. We knock at the bar of justice, asking simply for an equal chance. Thus, lifting as we climb is not just the motto of NACWC. It is the lifestyle that each member embodies daily. On behalf of the oldest Black women's organization to advocate and fight for the rights of all people, I proudly accept this award, and I'm humbled for the recognition you have awarded us. Thank you for awarding the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award to us. Thank you.
I think we're all humbled to be in the presence of these organizations and these leaders who have contributed so much for, I mean, collectively, it's more than 300 years of work to build this country, to reinforce our values, to create leaders, to build communities. It's an extraordinary record, and it's a real privilege to be able to support the award of the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service. Thank you so much. We have a number of questions here that, and we have a few minutes left. One very practical question is, these are such wonderful presentations, can we get the recording? This is being recorded, and it will be available on the WNDC Educational Foundation website. And we will certainly send it out to you, because there are many things we'd like to listen to again. And people also asked about the books. The books are also available. We've made an arrangement with Politics and Prose, so it's very easy to click and get advance copies and reserve your copies of these two extremely interesting books that are coming out. Mrs. Smith, you asked a question about Alice Paul and her relationship with Inez Mulholland. Would you like to expand on that?
I'm sorry, were you talking, you said I answered a question?
I believe you asked a question
No,
about Alice Paul, and would you like to expand on your question, and we'll find the best person to answer it?
I actually answered the question. Someone did ask a question about Alice Paul and the fact that she did not seem to be interested in working further on when a new amendment for the was asked. I try to remember the exact question, but the issue was whether or not, I'm going to try and find that question. It was Carol Levine who said, understanding the disappointment and unfairness of the disenfranchisement of colored women after the decades of effort, would there have been any realistic hope of any success of the federal legislation had Alice Paul embraced their cause in the 1920s, given the rampant racists at the time? I guess I'm wondering if Alice Paul's decision was indifference or simply a horrible political reality. I had actually done some research on the march itself in preparation for some speeches that I had given. And there was an interesting fact that I found, and that was that Alice Paul actually was not in favor of African-American women, Black women participating in the march. And I think it was also mentioned by someone that Mary Church Terrell was significant in terms of influencing her to change her stance on it. The other information I also found was Inez Mulholland, who, as everyone knows, is the one on the white horse wearing the gold crown. Her father was the treasurer of the NAACP, which had been fairly newly formed at that point in time. My understanding was that there was a great debate between the two of them in terms of the little color girls, as Dr. Parker mentioned, being in that march. And Alice Paul, then Inez Mulholland, had actually in the end refused to march if the march itself was not integrated and no longer a segregated march. So there was a kind of a tug of war between them in terms of whether or not African-American women would be able to participate. Inez Mulholland and Mary Church Terrell obviously won that battle of the day. So because I had done some research on that background, I went ahead and answered the question for her. But thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Much has been discussed about the southern states' limits. Excuse me, I just have about the southern states' limits on voter registrations. Are there any records of what northern or western states did to limit voter registrations by minorities? Dr. Jones, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. On this point, I'll recommend Alexander Kesar's book, which is a sweeping and comprehensive look at the history of the vote and voting rights in the U.S. And Kesar includes a number of very informative tables that show us that, in fact, yes, particularly Western states rely upon some of the same measures that Southern states do. Western states have in mind not only Black Americans, but Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, when they impose strictures like poll taxes and literacy tests. So it is not exclusively a Southern practice, but it is one that is ubiquitous throughout the South.
And I would add that a lot of Black women in the North and the West did vote, as Martha pointed out. In fact, there were very strong Republican organizations of Black women that they created in order to fight for federal anti-lynching laws and all kinds of other things after 1920. Eventually, by the time you get to the 1930s, they also become Democrats with the rise of the New Deal and Eleanor Roosevelt, if not Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who never endorsed a lynching amendment, so or federal anti-lynching laws. So I do think that it's fair to say, as Dr. Jones pointed out, that Black women did in fact vote and used their votes very effectively whenever they could.
Thank you. There's a question about Mrs. Bethune and meeting Ralph Bunche at the San Francisco conference establishing the United Nations. Were there collaborations of what types and how long?
Mrs. Bethune is part of a 3-person delegation that includes the NAACP head, Walter White, and also W.E.B. Du Bois. And the story goes that she finds herself not wholly a good fit with the men in the delegation. They have very different kinds of leadership and organizing styles. And this leads Mrs. Bethune, in fact, to develop new friendships and alliances with women of color from across the globe during the weeks in San Francisco. We have her reports. She appears publicly in San Francisco when the convention is not in session to remark some on this. And we know that she was a late addition to the delegation, that only with Mrs. Roosevelt's intervention was she included among this new 3-person delegation. But she was, I guess we'd say she had backup always, because with her was a delegation of women from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So she did not travel alone or face those political circumstances singly. There were many, many Black women observers who were also in attendance. And this is really the community that Mrs. Bethune collaborates with and draws upon as she advocates for the view that women of color, both from the US, from across the globe, their concerns need to be built into the foundation of the United Nations.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a question to the 3 recipients of the Mary Church Terrell Award. We now look at an electorate that is increasingly young, where over half of the electorate will be under the age of 30. What do you see, what challenges and opportunities do you see in motivating the next generation of voters, and both in terms of voter participation and civic engagement? Would someone like to start on that? Ms. Reed?
I can, I suppose. This is Beverly Smith, the national president for Delta. One of my biggest concerns, honestly, is apathy. They are seeing the civil rights movement today the way I saw it growing up for the first time. And I think there's a shift in their mindset, obviously. I'm hoping that the importance of elections really, unfortunately, the racism and the issues that are going on now should motivate them. We're obviously doing all we can to motivate them in terms of voting and making sure that they're looking out for voter suppression, that they're paying attention. But this younger generation grew up in a different world than we did. And, you always worry about forgetting the past, because if you forget the past, you tend to relive it in the future. So I think an education and this program that you're doing and the emphasis on the 19th Amendment brings the things that they need to remember back into light. The difficult times that women have had and African Americans, people of color have had, now are in the forefront. I think before the shift and the things that are happening now happen, there might have been a little bit more reluctance to vote. There has been a concern among young people that their vote doesn't count. I'm hoping in the past year, and definitely now, they understand that their vote is critical. So my concern is that they forget the very thing that you're trying to put in front of young people today. and that we all have a responsibility that they make sure that they understand that freedoms can be lost if they don't continue to participate in the elections and to vote, and not let their voices be silenced. There is power in their voice, and I think there is a need for them to understand that they may do it a little bit differently than we did, but they still need to be activists in their own way and definitely be at the table. The issue of women at the table is most important. You know, Shirley Chisholm once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. You know, we hear that a lot lately. They need to bring a whole lot of folding chairs and making sure that they're at the table, sitting in those seats where laws and laws are being made.
Dr. Johnson, can I just add one more thing? Because I agree with everything
Please.
that was said. I have a daughter who is 24, and I think that I can see in her differences that I didn't see from generations before. And I think there's a couple of things that make it different. The first thing is very similar to what we're saying, as they're having a chance to exercise their votes, their voices, whether it's in Black Lives Matter, whether it's in the things that they are agreeing or disagreeing with, before they weren't doing. So they have that. And I think the other thing is that everyone can be proud of, is that we're watching a change as we look at Senator Kamala Harris, a member of our organization, was coming to the forefront. And what she is telling us, and she's telling all those young people, it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, your race, your creed, but if you have that desire and want to serve, you can. And it's dependent on you to come out and bring your voices to vote. And I think those kind of things are what's making our young people take a minute to stop and think and say, the time is now to make the change. That's all.
In addition to what my colleagues have already said, I would like to add that we need to help them to understand the information that is put before them, to emphasize the values and the principles that are important, the ones that our forefathers and mothers brought us up on, to get them away from that sense of entitlement that I'm supposed to have this, that we need to show them that you work for it, you study for it, you learn to think for yourself. Don't be a follower, be a leader, investigate. Don't just look and take everything that people say at face value. There's a lot of misinformation out there, both from the top to the bottom. And we need to encourage them to think, to investigate, to research, and then vote. Make certain they vote no matter what. Encourage them to be independent thinkers after they have shown that they have investigated and they know what they're going to vote for.
Thank you so much. There's so much wisdom that you all have just expressed, and we really need to find ways to pass it on to the next generation. This is a bit of a shameless plug because we are having a session at 6 o'clock today on youth voting, tools and tactics for the next generation, because we thought we should end our centennial celebration with really taking that next step to speak with students and teachers and activists who work with schools and so on to encourage youth voting. So please join us if you would like to. I think it'll be a very interesting discussion. This has been an extraordinary discussion. I want to thank each one of you for contributing and making this a rich and inspiring afternoon. I will say that we have a number of other questions we haven't been able to get to. Most of the questions are, where can we get the books? So, and can we get a recording of this session? And so the answer is yes, definitely the books are available. If you want to go onto the website, we can do that. You can do that. And if we will be posting the recording as well. And people have also asked about a really quite special discussion that we had yesterday that was led by a DC teacher, Alicia Butler, who's the National History Teacher of the Year, with 3 outstanding scholars. So that was a very rich discussion as well. I just want to take this closing moment to thank, first of all, the recipients of the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award. We've said a lot of words. They are completely inadequate to really express the appreciation for the work that you and your sorors have done and your members have done. It's extraordinary to be able to spend some time and to honor your work. I want to thank the panelists, the presenters, and for making this a very special event. Our partners, some of whom are represented on the panel, others are in the audience. Arthelda Bush Williams has worked very closely with us. Diana Bailey in the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, National Women's History Alliance, and the National Women's History Museum and the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. One of the astonishing things is that we've actually been talking a lot about women from Washington, D.C. and organizations that were founded here in Washington. And I think that's something that we should all be very proud of. I want to thank the people who have turned this into a seamless production. This is actually our second video event that we've done, a Zoom event that we've done. And we want to thank everyone. A special shout out for Justice Ewell, who did a lot of the research on the organization and supported the committee. And thank all of the participants who joined us. I hope that you're as inspired as I am. We'll take this message forward. Thank you very much and good afternoon.